Morning. My name is Rich MacVarish. Here to talk about primarily analysis and thinking, right? So yesterday was a lot of good discussion during JB's presentation. There was a little bit of back and forth about bias, but the comment that he made that I think really kind of struck a chord with me was, as a field, we're producing people that come into our industry with a bunch of facts, but not really how to think about what we're doing, right? So what I want to talk about is how to think about thinking, right? Some people think this is a little fluffy. My original presentation, which I showed to a few people, they all came back and were like, well, it's a little preachy and not concrete. So I reworked it a little bit so that we're actually going to go through some of the different methods that make up structured analytic techniques, and 5 actual concrete things that you guys can take home and use, and a strong suggestion for some resources that you can go to work through these things on your own. So if science is nothing more than the refinement of everyday thinking, we really all need to be aware of how we apply rigor to our everyday thinking, right? How do we reduce errors in our thought process, right? There's a very large body of work out there. Most of what I'm drawing from is by a guy named Richards here and another guy named Randy Fearson. They did a lot of work funded by the government for the U.S. intelligence community. I am not a psychologist, right? I like to read the psychology part, but really I'm an analyst practitioner. So I'm more interested in how I can use these things to make my work product better. Before we can really start to talk about making our thought process better, we need to start with identifying why our thought process is broken and why we're not aware that our thought process is broken. And that all starts with thinking systems. How do we think about things? On a day-to-day basis, we use System 1 thinking. It's fast, it's intuitive, it's sort of efficient, it's mostly right most of the time. It's usually unconscious, but it's also the thing that allows us to get through our lives, right? It's the thing that allows you to decide which line you're going to get in at the checkout, which checkout line you're going to get in when you want to leave the grocery store. Because you're like, I want to get out of here the fastest. So what do? You develop a quick heuristic, you look at the lines, and you say, that one's the shortest. After a while, maybe you go to the same grocery store, and you notice that there's that one cash register operator who's always slow. So it really doesn't matter how long the line is, you start to avoid that register. System 2 thinking is slow, deliberate, conscious reasoning. Okay? Now, generally speaking, we don't use this system in our daily life. Right? It's not how we function. Because if you sat down before you wanted to drive to work every day to analyze the route that you were going to take based on the absolute latest possible information, that'd be a big chunk of your day. And if you decided to do that every day, you'd start to fall apart. All right? So we're going to do a quick experiment. Anybody who's seen this picture or knows what this picture is, please try to reframe your mind back to the first time you saw it. Anybody want to call out what they see here? Right, it's a bunch of rocks. Okay. One of these rocks is an IED. Anybody want to venture a guess which one? This one right here? The bottom left. All right, where's that laser pointer? I don't know how to use this thing. So, as each of you went through this, what you probably did were like, I'm not a geologist, right? I'm certainly not probably an IED expert. I don't really know what I'm looking for. So what you did is you started to look for maybe some attributes that signified something was different about that rock, okay? It's actually this one dead center in the bottom, right around 6 o'clock. You'll notice it's a little darker, the texture's a little different. It doesn't really fit with all the other rocks, okay? This is called attribute substitution. It's something that we use when we're looking at a complex problem or complex reality, right? That we can't fathom all the data, and sometimes we don't have the data we need. So we find something that's different, right? This is pretty common. It's a very common heuristic that people will use to look for things. Just to look for things that stand out. The problem comes when we use those heuristics either inappropriately or unconsciously and arrive at the wrong answer, right? So just like I was talking about earlier with somebody here, in our industry we commonly have the threat vulnerability coin, and the terms are sometimes used interchangeably because they're introduced together, they're seen as flip sides of the same coin. Cognitively, we'll connect those two things and we'll say, and sometimes we pick the wrong side of the coin. The flip side of a heuristic is cognitive bias. So you see something that looks like this. You're walking down the street. If you just spent the last 3 years of your life in Afghanistan looking at piles of rocks to recognize IEDs, and you look at this pile of rocks, you might instinctively start looking for an IED, even though the context is completely wrong, right? You're in your neighborhood, right? It works the other way too. If you spend all of your time in your neighborhood looking at something like this, your heuristic is, oh, look at the pile of rocks. That could be disastrous if you're walking past this pile of rocks at the wrong time, right? So there is a very large collection of bias available. We are all subject to all of them, right? What's interesting to me is today, there are memes about things like cognitive bias. My mother called me to tell me about how her friend fell victim to cognitive bias, and about confirmation bias, excuse me. How her friend was falling victim to confirmation bias and was only using facts that supported her case. During the conversation, she never once acknowledged that she's doing the same thing, right? So we all do this. It's not something that's limited to any one party. This is fascinating stuff. All right, if you go out and you click on one of these a day and read about it, it's great. What I have found for me as a practitioner is knowing all of these has done zero to help me actually get around them, right? Being aware that I have confirmation bias hasn't done anything to help me to prevent it. In addition to these problems, there's a number of external forces that are acting to undermine analysis, work product, and what I'll really say is rigor, right? Increased issue complexity. So things are getting harder to analyze. Sometimes some people will say that there's too much data. Others will say there's not enough data. A big issue is multidisciplinary teams, right? So maybe you have the security aspects of a problem, maybe you have the legal aspects of the problem, then you have how do we integrate, how do we come up with a solution that's actually effective, right? That's both legal and security. Or the flip side of that, how do I use these things, how do I use the legal aspects to inform my security decisions to inform legal positions. Increased information sharing. it was a big assumption out there, and we're going to talk about assumptions in a minute, that information sharing is always good, right? That's a big push, especially by companies that are trying to sell information sharing. There's a big push for that within the intelligence community, within the government. Everybody's got to share all their information. The reality is, if you don't take that within an operational context of why you want to share the information, it doesn't mean anything. The benefit to this can be that you have differing perspectives from different organizations. And more perspectives are always good. Diversity of thought is always good. Expertise dispersion. If you're a technical expert, you might not be an expert on, well, in the news, on, say, Russian information warfare doctrine, or the Chinese information warfare doctrine, or why somebody from Russia might not care that their malware and that their entire op was blown, right? Because you don't understand them culturally. You're looking at the technical aspects. And that assumption can lead, and those assumptions can lead to problems because you're not a domain expert. Also, the lines are starting to blur between who's collecting information, or who's collecting information, who's analyzing that information, who the decision maker is, right? So you might be the decision maker for what to collect because you think it will inform the analysts, right? And if you're, the next one is homogeneous mental models. This is a huge problem, right? When you don't have diversity of thought, you're going to come to everybody's going to come to the same conclusions. Everybody, and this goes back to attribute substitution, right? If you're, where people are forcing diversity through, we need more women, we need more minorities, we need these things, right? That does not guarantee diversity of thought. I agree that we need those things for other reasons, but it doesn't enforce diversity of thought. The only way you can enforce diversity of thought is to actually map out what people are thinking and compare them, right? So if you're not measuring your diversity of thought, things start to fall apart. But how do we do that? We need to externalize our thought process, right? So everybody's been talking about models. There was lots of discussion about models. What really are models? They're a way to externalize our thought process, right? There are things that allow us to communicate and convey what we are thinking. Sometimes we do this for ourselves. Typically, we want to externalize so they can be shared, built on, and easily critiqued. We don't generally like that last one. Nobody wants to be critiqued, right? However, if you want to build rigor in this field, if we want to build rigor, not only in analysis, but in security, we have to be open to critique, we have to be open to making the wrong assessment, and we have to be, and this is one of the reasons that I was so excited about this conference, right? Because that's really what this conference seems like to me. It's a place for people to come and openly bring ideas without being concerned about being right or wrong. Structured analytic techniques. So this is where we're going to start getting into some practice, right? There's 55 odd structured analytic techniques that are part of this taxonomy. Okay, they're roughly broken down into, well, it's on the slide. So you've got decomposition which allows you to kind of break down the problem. Idea generation. A lot of that is just variations on brainstorming, scenario and indicators, and then hypothesis generation. That's a big one that, right? Most people will go with their one hypothesis. They'll take that thing that they think it is and they'll just run with it. Then you've got assessment of cause and effect, challenge analysis. If you're not formalizing the process of challenging your own ideas in what you do, then you cannot really claim that you're being rigorous. and conflict management. So up here we've got decision support, but I want to talk about conflict management. Once you start challenge analysis, you're going to need a way to deal with conflict. Okay? Because if you've got 3 or 4 people who have strong opinions sitting in the same room, they're going to disagree. And they're all going to stick to their guns, and they're all going to... So there has to be an actual formal process. A big part of this process is externalizing, right? It is capturing the entire process, right? It is writing it down. It is using the tools that are available. If you go out and do a search online for this, there are tools. Like every analyst in the world has recreated the spreadsheets needed to do this 1,000 times. There are also online services. There's things that you can buy. There's packages. Park did one of the first tools for this, and it's released publicly because it was paid for by the government. That was part of the agreement. But from a practice, Randy Fearson wrote an article for Journal of Strategic Security a few years ago that kind of broke down what master thinkers do, right? How do they do it? If you're not a master thinker, right, if you practice enough, you will become one. And the interesting thing to me is that if you do system 2 thinking enough, if you do that rigorous analysis and using that reasoning enough, it pushes you to start using it intuitively. It just kind of happens on its own, even when you don't externalize it, even when you don't write it down, even when you don't use the tools. This can be a lot of fun at parties when you're playing devil's advocate all the time, and then shift your position when you win over the other guy, right? It makes conversation a lot of fun for other people. Anybody who knows me has probably called me on that 1,000 times. So what are the 5 habits? 1, establish a culture of challenging key assumptions. We're going to go into each of these and how to do this in a rigorous, externalized manner, writing things down. Always consider alternative explanations, including the null hypothesis and deception, right? In IT, security, everybody jumps to the deception, right? Like, how many people at some point were like, oh, my computer rebooted. Somebody hacked it, right? So you start looking for malware. At some point in every technical security analyst work life, they've done that. Typically, it's pretty early on because after a while you stop caring, or you've taken precautions to protect yourself so you don't have to care. The next one is instinctively looking for inconsistent data so that you can dump the hypotheses that don't matter, right? So the ideas that you have that don't matter and aren't supported by the data that you have, you can dump. Now, there are some problems with that because if you don't have enough data, right, then that can lead to a problem. But there are other formalized processes to deal with that too. The next one is focus on the key drivers that best explain what has occurred or is about to happen. So here, really what you're doing is you're looking not so much at the micro, the data, right? You're looking at big picture stuff, right? What's larger than the problem that I have, or the question that I was asked? Anticipating a customer's needs and understanding the overarching context for analysis. Again, this is kind of expanding it out even a little bit more, right? So that you're kind of trying to expand from the specific question that you're trying to do, and you go out, and then you slowly come back in with different perspectives. So the first one, challenging key assumptions. So there's an SAT, a statistical analysis technique called the key assumptions check. So this is a very systematic approach to qualifying the assumptions that you've made. Now, the thing about assumptions is they're assumptions. You might not know that you've made them. So if you don't have a formalized process to actually run through these, then you're never really going to know that you made an assumption and whether or not it was right or correct. Many of these things actually require 2 or 3 people because you need to bounce off of each other, right? It's kind of hard to do some of this stuff solo. It's hard to identify your own assumptions. So the reason we do this is, well, it's up here. You guys can read the slide, but primarily it's about identifying your assumptions so that you can remove them. So here's some examples of assumptions that I've actually heard come out of people's mouths or are related to things that I've had to work on. So hackback provides cyber deterrence. Okay, all right, like why, how? Best practices will keep me secure. I hate the term best practices. I know some other people in this room have said that same thing, right? Specific to an analysis project I did several years ago, microvisor products improve security, and microvisor products will sell well. Now, those are flip side, those are interrelated, right? And I was asked to identify whether or not a microvisor would improve security and whether or not it would sell well. It turns out that it did, that the microvisor itself improved security, but the system in which, the entire ecosystem in which it relied was fundamentally flawed because it was based on trusting DNS. So I think you guys can all kind of see where that goes. However, the flip side of that was, yes, they will sell remarkably well for a while, right? It's just part of a business intelligence project that I worked on about whether or not we should acquire a company. So the method is, it's as simple as list your working assumptions, right? So how do you do that? The easiest way to do that is to go back to the thing that you're trying to identify, or the question you're trying to answer, and write your answer, and then systematically pick it apart. This is where having other people help is good, right? Because you are not going to probably be able to identify your own. Assess each assumption for support. For example, an assumption might be that microvisor products improve security. Great. Okay, why? How? What do they do? Is there a larger ecosystem around it that it depends on? Does that improve security if I rely on it? What happens if that system gets broken down? So as you refine your assumptions, you can boil them down. And then when it comes to your unsupported functions, like, hey, yes, the microvisor is great, it's super solid, but it has this reliance on DNS for its functioning. Maybe we should go take a look at how it interacts with DNS as part of its trust model to see if that needs to be researched further. Consider alternatives. So the statistical, I'm just going to say SAT because it's kind of a mouthful to keep saying. There's an actual process for generating multiple hypotheses. We do this because by generating in a formalized manner multiple hypotheses, we get confidence that we're going to kind of cover the right scenario, right? It also allows us to challenge any preconceived ideas. If you go in with your hypothesis of Iraq has weapons of mass destruction, and that's the classic example in this space, right? Like, and you don't even check the null hypothesis, or you don't check for deception because you don't know that the source that told you that, okay, is correct, then you're going to fall apart. So what's the method? You define the issue by asking a question. You jump in with a lead hypothesis. In this example, we're saying, hey, is an animal rights activist group going to try to create a negative sentiment using social media against my company? You flip that around, you turn it into a statement, right? You go from the question to the statement. You brainstorm variations on who, what, when, where, and why. Typically, you only need to pick 2 or 3. Sometimes you only need 1, depends on the question. So here we've got PETA, Viva, Nature Watch. And then you have to say, well, why would they try to do this? Well, primarily, they probably want consumers to not buy my product. They're trying to start a boycott. They might be trying to influence legislation that's currently up, right? So you can look at the timing. They might be just to try to gain media exposure. Petitions, memes, whatever. So you break these things down, and you start to map them out, right? You create variations. And then you stack rank them. You just give them a number. Do I think this is going to happen? Do I think this is going to not happen? What's my confidence here? Again, this is primarily about covering a wide range of ideas and then ranking them against each other. Identifying inconsistent data. This is now taking the data that you have and mapping it. What time? I'm out. Am I out of town? Okay, good. All right. Yeah, the timer didn't work. So I'm gonna burn through this, right? Competing hypothesis, method, externalize it, basically create a map like this. By the way, I have no association with Threat Connect, right, at all, but I literally started to do this and found theirs and was like, okay, this is good enough, right? But basically what you're doing is you're taking your data, you're gonna map it. This is actually not a very good analysis because basically they say for or against versus, oh, I lost my place here, versus like kind of a more granular scale. But it gets the job done, right? So if you gotta do something fast, there you go. Focus on key drivers. So what are the forces that are gonna influence what's happening next? This is a little graph about what's gonna happen to domestic radicalized groups within the United States, depending on what happens, right? Are they willing to play by the rules? And what's their mobilization capability, right? So if they can mobilize and they're not willing to play by the rules, then we're gonna have sporadic violence. If they can mobilize, right? You can look at the graph. And so anticipate and understand. I'm gonna go through that. I'm just gonna blow past that, other than to say that really this is where you get into like pre-mortem analysis. And that's when you get towards the end of your project and you flip back and say, okay, it's 6 months from now, it's 5 years from now, whatever the time frame is for your analysis, and you say, I was completely wrong. Why was I wrong? Right? And that allows you to go back and check everything from a very wide view down through your analysis. So this is actually one of my favorite quotes. The intuitive mind is a sacred gift, and the rational mind is a faithful servant. We've created a society that honors the servant and has forgotten the gift. All this talk about rigor and science and pushing things out and externalizing and using system 2 thinking should never undermine that your sense to listen to your gut to create at the outset, all right? Your instincts are the product of your experience, and if you're an expert in your field, you probably have some pretty good instincts about it. The issue is when you're starting out and you don't have that expertise, how do you get started? All right, so that's it. I don't know if we have time for Q&A, but I will say that if you want to get started, this is the place. Okay, if you want kind of the early work by Richard Heuer, Psychology of Intelligence Analysis is a gold mine of information. If you're just looking for, I want it now, I need something I can use right now, the second book by Heuer and Pearson, Structured Analytic Techniques for Analysis. I have copies of these books if you want to flip through them. This is a how-to book. It's a full lexicon, it's a full taxonomy, It is everything that you need to get started here. And then if you want to practice, there's a great case studies book. That's it. I'm done. Any questions? I think I'm being punted, so.
You can answer